Hello and good morning, everyone. Only Positivity here. I have my coffee with me, ready to kick off podcast number 24 on this playlist that I'm looking to launch called Elevated Thoughts. So, before diving into the book and everything for today, let's just start with the level set. So, as I endeavor upon pursuing knowledge and life experience in this next phase of life through fitness, photography, traveling, and much more, one habit that I've really formed is reading. So, this podcast essentially goes through some of the books I've been reading as of late, taking those lessons learned and applying them to experiences in my life. So, before diving into the book, let's go ahead and start with today's story. So, I actually randomly thought of this story this morning when I was brushing my teeth. I just started busting out laughing. So, just as a precursor, as you get older, you start to notice like little tendencies about people, their little nuances and things like that. One thing you start to notice is people's defense mechanisms as you get to know them, right? Some people, they point blame at others, or some people laugh at themselves, or some people will, poke jokes at others and things like that. So you start to notice people's defense mechanisms or their behavior traits. So, coming back to myself, one thing that I really do is I laugh at myself a lot. And so if like, something, we're in a conversation and we're bouncing back and forth, like I'm gonna roast myself as well as other people as well, right? Just to show that like, I can take it and I can also dish it. So, in this particular situation, this takes me back a few years ago when we were at my buddy's place downtown. And, a lot of times there'll be some other people at, these functions of ours or these like engagements that we get into. So we're pre-gaming at my buddy's place. And, some of his friends are there, his work friends, some of his cousins are there. And also our core group of guy friends is there as well. And one thing about our core group of guy friends is we roast each other pretty heavily, inappropriately sometimes, but that's just our humor, right? We're silly, we're goofy, we have raunchy humor, and we all really love that about each other. So anyway, on this particular night, so I had this huge zit on my forehead, right? And I don't really get acne that much, but every now and then when I do, it's like a very aggressive or angry pimple. So I had one on my head, on my forehead, and there's no hiding it, right? Like I don't wear makeup or anything like that, so it's just there, it's present, and it was like really red, and like I said, it was angry. So there's some people that I'm introduced to at this pregame, and we're talking, right? We're catching up, we're doing this, and I'm putting it out there. I'm like, you know what, dude, I got this massive zit on my forehead, and yeah, I just sprouted this morning. I don't know what to do about it. Like, it's just so weird, it looks so gross, and those people are being really nice because they don't know me that well, and they're like, oh no, we didn't even notice it until you mentioned it. Like, you look fine, all good. And I'm just like putting it out there, right? I'm just like setting it at the forefront. So all the while, everyone's kind of saying, "Oh no, it's cool, man. Like no worries, it looks okay. Doesn't look too bad." And so one of my best friends is in the back, casually making drinks, and he walks by and hears this, and he goes, "Fuck that! You've been thinking too hard, bitch. What is that on your forehead?" I go, "Oh shit." So I spit out my drink. I bust out laughing, and I'm dying at this point, right? Because everyone is being so nice to me, and my dude comes from the back end and just gives me the ultimate roast, right? So it was the funniest thing I've heard in a while. I was laughing about this morning when I was brushing my teeth. So no lessons to be learned, I guess, besides being able to laugh at yourself, right? No one's perfect, and that's okay, right? And I feel really confident when I have my guys around. We roast each other, and it's fun. So, that's the story for today. So reverting back to the book, right? So we're going to be going through the crime book by Big Ideas Simply Explained, and we're on part 4 today. So there's many types of crime that's occurred, and crime has evolved through the ages, right? We go through bandits, robbers, arsonists, con artists, white collar crimes, and then for today we're going to be going through organized crime. So one interesting thing about this book is that it gives you a new perspective on crime, right? So what I gain from it is that crime is a direct reaction to economic and political policy, right? If there's poverty involved, people are going to rebel against it, right? They're going to find ways to get out of their social standing, and really make their ends meet, right? So a lot of times you might think crime is just, hey, this is a bad person committed a crime. But a lot of times when people are put in difficult situations, they have to choose, right? Especially if they're supporting their family and others and whatnot. So, um, like I said, today's topic is organized crime. So the book defines it as a category of offenses that is perpetrated by a group of people with a formal structure whose primary purpose is to obtain money through illegal activities, right? So we talk about groups of people that come together to perform illegal activities and they have an organized structure within, right? And the purpose of that structure or the purpose of that organization is to commit crime. So the first story we're going to go into is the Sicilian Mafia in the 1800s. And I'm really interested in the mafia, love mafia movies, love mob movies. Something about them really interests me. So, we talk about Peaky Blinders, Goodfellas, The Sopranos, of course, the Godfather movies, Casino, even. Like I'm a big fan of all those movies. And that generation of actors was really good too. Not too much to do with what we're talking about today, but very interested by the mafia. And one thing that's frustrating about the way the book goes into it is they talk about the mafia in Italy, right? Um, I'm most interested, or we see in mainstream media like the New York mob or the New Jersey mob or even the Chicago mob, right? But this passage goes through the mafia in Italy itself, so the roots, the origins. So, going off that note, let's go ahead and just talk about the origins of the mafia. So you wouldn't really like think of this as the origination point, but the mafia started in the 19th century in orange and lemon groves, right? So, agriculture in Western Sicily. So, citrus fruits were in high demand, and the output for these fruits was good in Sicily. So people could turn a substantial profit if they were able to, get the growing right. So, um, given that potential from earning and selling these fruits, something called the citrus fruit protection rackets started occurring. Um, the book uses this example of a farmer who was driven from his farm by racketeers. So going forward, that farmer told the police about this whole situation. That people are coming onto his farm, causing trouble, destroying his plants. But the police did nothing. So what that really insinuates is that the racketeers were working with the police as well. So the police probably had a cut of the profits. So the main mobster or gangster during this time in Italy was Antonio Giamona, and he wanted to develop a monopoly on that fruit, right? Once again, we see with the con artists, all people who are committing these crazy crimes, um, they're finding profit and opportunity in any circumstance, right? We saw with Victor Lustig, selling the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal, selling swampland with Charles Ponzi, postage stamps, and going all the way forward here to citrus fruits, right? So people are going to find those opportunities to change their circumstances. So we go forward. We talk about Antonio Giamona, right? So his reach applied to local police, local politicians, even the drivers and dock workers that transported these goods back and forth. So he was able to like strong arm, blackmail, or even bribe these people. And the book goes forward to say like the main source of power here though was the ability for the mafia to embed themselves into the government, right? So they would coax government officials and influence them, um, the people in power to make decisions, right? And that's where the real power comes from. So, we saw in the Godfather movies. Anyone who's watched that trilogy is one of the best series of all time. How senators and police officers would turn a blind eye to like racketeering, gambling, even prostitution, whether they were forced to or they were taking a cut of the action, right? Um, we saw with I forget the character's name in the first Godfather movie where the police captain was working with Salazzo, right? And that family, and they were really hoping to pull off all the guards from Don Corleone's hospital so that another mafia family could come and kill him, right? So the police can be involved, public officials can be involved, and I'm assuming like even in Sicily, a deal would go like, okay, either you make this deal with me and you'll turn a profit from it, it'll be illegal, or I'll kill you, right? Going forward to God, the Godfather is saying, I'll make him an offer he can't refuse, right? Um, so, coming back to the book here, after World War One, authorities start to look deeper into the mafia's activities. So the authorities would arrest like some of these high-profile mob bosses, um, but they never really attacked the mafia as an entire organization. So, when one boss was in jail, he could still run the operation from jail, and have his capos, kind of take over while he was away. And going forward, right, they have a whole structure. So the head of the family is the Don, right? So like Don Corleone from The Godfather. Then the next up is his advisor, the consigliere, and then you have the capo regimes, which are his captains, right? Maybe four or five other families underneath the Don, and beneath them are the button men, right? The soldiers. So they're the ones who are going to perform the hits and whatnot. You push a button on a guy. That's what they say. So, coming back to the book here, around 1925, Benito Mussolini started a task force to crack down on mafia activity. So at that point, they had incarcerated about, 11,000 Sicilians and used a lot of strong arm tactics to catch them. They would also conduct mass trials, and the public was not made aware of this at all. So, that's a little bit, uh, I guess, swindling on the government side or, unethical. But I guess they sought to fight fire with fire, Benito Mussolini did. So what you can go off of that note is public outrage, right? Mafia would kill people for profit, right? Whether they were civilians, public officials, police officers, whatever. So it's not surprising that once there's public outrage, action is going to be taken swiftly. So, going forward, about 500 mafiosi, what they call them is mafia bosses, they went to America and established the Sicilian mob there. Now, I wish they went into it further, but that's kind of where they stopped. But if you think about it, right, even in the Godfather movies, Vito Corleone comes to Ellis Island in like 1907 or something like that. And you can imagine that they go to America and they land on the East Coast, right, kind of the Boston, New York area. So um, essentially, they established their mobs like in New York and New Jersey, right? So really close to the immigration point for these Italian immigrants and mob bosses. So, another interesting point, in 1957, there was a mobster named Joe Bonanno, and he established a committee to resolve disputes amongst Italian families. So, um, that to me is very interesting, right? Because they break laws, right? Mafia breaks the laws, they do illegal activities, but they follow their own set of rules. Um, so you see something here about not following an established authority, but still needing some kind of authority, right? So this committee would have punishments and processes for breaking rules, right? But ultimately, that commission was super useless because the mafia families are used to operating by themselves. So a committee such as this really wasn't taken well. So the first mafia war between families took place in 1961, took place between the Greco and the La Barbera families. There was a total of about 68 victims from that war. And then we move forward to the Chiaculi massacre, or the Chiachuli massacre, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, which occurred in 1963. So at this point, 7 police and military officers were killed. So if we think about this, in in 1961, the first war was 68 victims. That's significantly more than 7 in 1963, right? So in those 68 victims, they don't really go into what that demographic comprised of, but they do say in 1963 that there was military and police officers killed. Now, if a police officer or a military officer gets killed, there's going to be some backlash there, right? The government cannot let the public killing of government officials go unnoticed. So essentially, this war started in 1963 because there was a bomb intended for a member of the Greco family. But the police force tried to disarm it, and they did it unsuccessfully. And ultimately, police officers killed trying to defuse that bomb. So after that, they really militarized. So they arrested about 1,200 mafiosis. The government established an anti-mafia task force. Um, and then this opened the way, though, for a new mob family, the Corleone family, right? So the Godfather series is based loosely on a true story of the Corleone family and their dominance in the mafia industry, right? So there was another war in the 80s between the Corleone family for the dominance of the Cosa Nostra, right? Or that's what they call the mafia. So the Corleone family rose to power and accompanied that with a dramatic increase in murders of public figures, right? So, in the Godfather movie, they make them seem like these anti-heroes, right? Like they weren't trying to be violent people; they were just trying to make a name for themselves, right? But in reality, a lot of people were murdered, a lot of people were killed. I love the movies, but it may paint a different picture than what was actually happening. So, a lot of chief prosecutors, police captains, other officials were disappearing or found dead. So, things were getting worse. So after this point, it became illegal to be part of any mafia associated group. And then there was additional legislative action taken as well. So they put a law in place that if uh, a mafia boss was convicted, right? Um, they would take all of his wealth, so he couldn't exercise power from prison. And we see that a lot, especially in Sopranos, right? Um, with the New York City mob, one of the main bosses was put in jail, and they snatched all his wealth from him, so he was pretty much useless at that point. So, obviously the mafia are going to go back and forth, and more violence came about. Many more public officials were murdered, tensions rose. Um, if legislation was passed, the mafia would respond with killing someone. Um, and then finally, in 1987, the police force had enough information to arrest and convict about 485 mafiosi, right? And they were sentenced to a combined total of over 2,700 years in jail. And so this is where the mafia had their ultimate downfall. Um, the mafiosi who weren't incarcerated or were attempted to be incarcerated would cut deals for less jail time. They were turned informants, right? So you think about it. Under the pressure of facing, a significant amount of jail time, a lot of people are going to stick to their principles, right? Stick to their guns, but a lot are going to cut deals too. So they start to conduct sting operations. And then the Italian government also sent about 8,000 soldiers to take charge of the day-to-day police activities in Italy. So, like I said, they were setting up sting operations, and ultimately, this killed the mafia's activities. Now we don't know like if they're still operating to this day and whatnot, but the police force came at them with precision, right? And I'm sure their activities are very, very, very minimal these days, but I could be wrong. So to wrap up this story, maybe let's just talk about Michael Corleone's character because I think Al Pacino did a great job um, with his role as Michael Corleone. So, for those of you that haven't seen it, I don't want to ruin it for you, but it's a very long movie, about 3 hours long. So, Michael Corleone came back from the war, and he didn't want any part of his family's mafia business, right? He wanted to be a legitimate citizen, and that's why he went to fight in the war, right? A lot of immigrants will tell you to like not fight, don't join the army, right? Like, what are you fighting for, But Michael Corleone is like, I'm a citizen of this country. This country has given me a lot of prosperity, so I'm gonna fight for it. His family was even mad at him for going, right? Him and Sonny got into a huge fight over it, but he still went. But once he saw his father in danger with like Salazzo and that family, Michael Corleone knew he could use his military experience to triumph in that situation because the family structure, right, with a consigliere, is set up for him to be like a general or a commander of his troops or his battalion, right? So I'm sure he got a taste of like that army life again, and we see that with a lot of PTSD and things like that. So he was changed. You could see once he started getting power, and his family started triumphing, that he got caught up in that life. So a very sad story for the Corleone family, in terms of the way it's portrayed in the Godfather movies, but a brilliant movie, great acting. So yeah, I would suggest everyone watch that. So we'll hop off the mafia, um, and we'll move forward to our next story, which is the Wild Bunch. So this takes place in America, between 1889 and like 1908. So some just setting the landscape here. The main territories here are Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. So we just talked about the mafia, that had a very organized structure. So, judging by the name of this one, the Wild Bunch, I'm sure you can assume that they weren't as organized, right, as a mafia was. So, Butch Cassidy was the leader of the Wild Bunch, and he was born in Utah, to a Mormon family in 1866. So he got the name Cassidy from a cowboy that used to work on his ranch, um, and he picked up Butch during a stint, they say, at a butcher's shop. So they don't really go into it too much, but I'm assuming some type of violence occurred over there. So Butch Cassidy is his new name. So, Butch Cassidy committed his first crime in 1889, and he was 23 at this point. So him and his friends went to some bars in Colorado, and they robbed it, right? And they made off with about $24,000, which is about $650,000 today. So a large sum there. So after that, right, you get the taste of crime, spoils, right? Better than working a real job, I suppose. Um, they became train robbers, and they got that taste of that life of crime. So their modus operandi, right, was they would lay low, in these canyons in Utah, or Wyoming, right, for months. They would just lay low, lay low, lay low, and they would hide out in cabins or on ranches. And they actually had good rapport with the ranches they would hide out on. A lot of they would protect. These ranches from different racketeers and other cowboys trying to like loot and pillage around there. But anyway, once they felt ready, they would venture out and rob some trains across the western states. So once again, we see this modus operandi or this code of conduct. Okay, so we see with the mafia, Peaky Blinders, Sopranos, they have their own code of conduct. Butch Cassidy claims he never killed a man, but there was at least one instance where someone was killed during a train robbery that he was involved in. So once again, breaking the law but obeying the rules. Um, he once robbed a train with his group outside of Wyoming in 1899. And the way they would do this was they would detach the last cars, from the train, okay, right before a bridge. So that was the cars with probably people on it or things that weren't valuable, and everything that was valuable was released right before the bridge, and then they would make their way across the bridge and blow up the bridge, so that half the train is across the bridge and half the train is on the other side of the bridge. And then they would take all the valuables, and in this particular instance, they made off with about $30,000, which is almost $900,000 today. So, this style of robbery is very sloppy, right? And it's very high profile because there's a lot of goods on there. There's people involved, and things like that. So you get the notion that they're going to be caught at some point, right? So, Sheriff Josiah Hazen, was assigned to this case, to catch the Wild Bunch, and he led a team across a 75-mile manhunt for the Butch Cassidy gang. Um, and 75 miles is kind of a lot right now, actually, in a car. But back then, it was probably a big, big radius, to look for a few people, right? So 75 miles is pretty big back in the day on horseback or whatever. So ultimately, Josiah caught up with the gang at Castle Creek Ravine, and there was a shootout. And the sheriff was killed, and the rest of the gang escaped, right? So unsuccessful manhunt there. But after this, the Wild Bunch knew that they couldn't operate in these big numbers anymore. So they started robbing in groups of three or four. And as they kept robbing, obviously they gained more notoriety and they became more popular. And so not only did state authorities come after them, but federal authorities as well. And there was a dead or alive warrant put on them. So, since they're operating in smaller numbers, they're starting to get picked off one by one, right? They're starting to get shot, killed, arrested one by one. So after a few years of doing this, the remaining gang members, including Butch Cassidy, they fled to South America and they robbed and pillaged down there a little bit. But there was one final shootout in November of 1908 where Butch Cassidy was killed, right? So he died in his mid 40s, must have led an extremely entertaining life, right? It was probably very adrenaline heavy, but we see with a lot of these mob stories and these bandit stories, like ultimately, if you're breaking the law, you're hurting people, you're corrupt, life is going to end in sadness for you, one way or the other. Going back to The Godfather, in the final episode or the final story, um, Michael Corleone dies at the end of the movie, but he loses his wife. His daughter dies. His son wants nothing to do with him. He ultimately dies in Italy by himself with no one with him, right? So just a really, really sad story here with the Wild Bunch, with the Godfather as well. So, that was the story of the Wild Bunch. Um, and then we'll move forward into our final story for today, which is the beer wars, which occurred in my hometown, Chicago, Illinois. Not sure if I'm proud of it or not, but occurred in Chicago, Illinois from 1923 to 1929. Probably a bigger gap there, but we're talking about the beer wars themselves. So, a quick illustration, painting the picture for you guys, is there was a Friday night in Chicago, and six gangsters bust into a saloon and they attack the bar owner. They beat him senseless. And a few days prior to that, the saloon owner had refused to purchase beer from a Chicago Southside gang called the O'Donnell Gang. And he's like, I have to remain loyal to the Saltese McErlane Gang, right? So you see some different factions on the south side of Chicago here. So a theme you'll see with this, with mobs and mafias and organized crime, is that innocent people are going to pay in blood or money, whatever, for the rifts amongst the mobs, right? So um, the O'Donnell gang in this situation threatened the bar owner to purchase from them, and they left him with multiple skull fractures. And like I said, this gang violence was a direct result of prohibition, right? Public policy in the 1920s. Um, they assumed that prohibition would drive crime down, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But essentially, like I said, prohibition outlawed the sale of liquor in the United States, and so that brings opportunity, right? Bootleggers began to surface and fill that demand for liquor. So they would smuggle liquor in from other countries and package it in their own way. And we saw in Peaky Blinders that um, Thomas Shelby was sending single malt whiskey and gin to Canada and America, where there was prohibition, right? He was hiding it in car part boxes. So, like I said, the mafia was heavily involved here, and they gained even more power through the success of this smuggling and this prohibition period. So, we talk about the most notorious mobster, right? And obviously, if you think about Chicago mob, you're obviously gonna think about Al Capone. So, it was estimated that Al Capone probably earned $60 million at the time, which amounts to about 900 million today, and that was each year. So he ultimately had a monopoly over the liquor trade in Chicago, especially on the south side of the city. Now, I could be speculating here, but this may be why the south side of Chicago is so poverty stricken right now, right? It could have something to do with those beer rackets, liquor rackets back in the day. So coming back to Al Capone, he worked for a guy named Johnny Torrio, and Johnny had divided up the South Side into multiple territories. Each territory had its own gangs, and they would supply these speakeasies. So now I didn't know what a speakeasy was, like I'll be honest about that, but I hear it a lot. It sounds like a cool word. But ultimately, speakeasies were places where there was liquor funneled through it during Prohibition, right? Um, and each territory had its own gangs, like I said, had their own speakeasies. They would supply brothels and casinos with their liquor. The north side was controlled by the Irish American mob, which makes total sense because if anyone has ever been to the north side of Chicago, there's a lot of Irish influence in terms of the pubs, restaurants, and the look and feel in general. Um, so the gangs would always fight over customers, and they would undercut each other and things like that. They would threaten bar owners and steal from each other's distributors. So once again, we see a deal or death here for anyone involved, especially the bar owners. So obviously, right, a lot of these turf struggles would turn violent right away. And that's where the gun, known as the Chicago typewriter, came into play, right? And that was the Thomas machine gun, otherwise known as the Tommy gun. So talking about the beer wars themselves, it was mainly between the O'Donnell gang, the Saltese McErlins gang, the Capone gang, and the Sheldon gang. Um, so flash forward, there was a day where a Sheldon gang member was shot and killed by a Saltese McErlin mobster. Um, so essentially, a North Side Irish mob boss was killed in 1924. Um, so after that, Torrio retired because he had also survived an assassination attempt, and he handed all of his business over to Al Capone at this point. So Al Capone inherited a war. Um, and this war came to a climax during the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1924. And this is where 7 Northside gangsters were killed. So, flash forward to the end of Prohibition. Um, Capone started expanding into racketeering, prostitution, trafficking, and dominated Chicago for many years. Um, and what's funny about that was, I watched this movie called Untouchables with Kevin Costner from back in the day, but I read up that, it wasn't really any of Capone's illegal activities that got him incarcerated. He was actually incarcerated on tax fraud, right? Because you have to report income, and he wasn't reporting income, and that's how he got thrown in jail. So, like I said, your illegal activities are going to get you caught in some facet or other. But let's talk about prohibition itself, okay? So, like, let's talk about the economic effect of that. So, like I said, public policy creators thought that, driving down prohibition or, outlawing liquor was going to result in a downward spiral in crime. But it actually did the exact opposite. So, crime rates rose by 24%, which is extremely high, and it also opened the way for black market liquor. Um, they also created a Bureau of Prohibition, which costs about $4 million to operate every year. So high cost there. We talk about manufacturing, right? Manufacturing went down as well because people weren't creating liquor anymore or manufacturing it. So taverns and plants closed. And going forward, a lot of large manufacturers were shut down, and that causes a reverse in innovation, right? So we talk about let's look at companies today like Apple, Google, Tesla, Amazon. These are all they're all titans of industry, right? And they're at the forefront of innovation. So if you were to cut off a company like that, there's going to be some downward effects, right? Downstream effects of it. Innovation is not going to be as heavily emphasized. Um, these big organizations have the resources to constantly innovate. So going back to prohibition, the advancements in the industry halted, right? Um, and there was almost a reversal of technological advancements in this era because they had made it illegal. So ultimately, just a lot of food for thought there in terms of crime, right? And it being a reaction to economic situations. So, that's all I got for you guys today. I hope you guys are enjoying the podcast series. Feel free to leave me any feedback. And remember, only positivity. Thanks, guys.